Come close now, my children. Bring your weary ears and your heavy hearts. Sit upon the ground of memory, for what I'm fixing to tell ain't just some story spun from air. It's a piece of life that still beats in the red clay earth. I speak as one who crossed the salt-thick waters of the Middle Passage, as one who heard the creaking of chains singing names that the ocean tried to swallow whole. I speak 'cause the dead asked it of me, and today, child, they callin' for grace. Lord have mercy on this old soul, but some names refuse to die 'cause the earth herself won't close over 'em. Grace, that name carries weight heavier than iron shackles, deeper than the furrows cut by plantation plows. Her name don't rest quiet in the ground like it ought to. No, sir. Rises up with the morning mist over the cotton fields, whispers through the Spanish moss hanging like hanged ghosts in them Louisiana bayous, and echoes in the silence of empty slave quarters where the wood still remembers the prayers spoken in tongues the white man never learned. Sweet Jesus, how the old folks say her name when the moon goes dark and the night gets thick as molasses. Grace, they whisper. Grace of the electric saw. Not 'cause it was her choosing, understand, but 'cause that's what the suffering made of her. That's what the cruelty carved into her very bones until she became something more than human, something less than free, but something that wouldn't bow down no more. In them days of deep sorrow, down in the heart of plantation country where the cotton grew white as bone and twice as bloody, there lived a girl child who was born to the sound of her mama's muffled crying. Born under a sky that made no promises, in a place where the sun didn't shine to warm. It watched. It judged. It counted the days left in a body before that body gave out from the weight of bondage. The plantation where Grace drew her first breath was a place of saws and gears and hands made hard by holding whips instead of children. The work there didn't stop when the body begged for rest. Lord, no. The work kept on like the flow of a merciless river, carrying away hope and health and sometimes whole families on its dark current. The saw in that place, that electric saw, wasn't just a tool for cutting timber. Mercy me, it was a threat, a symbol of who held power and who bled in silence. Great God Almighty, how that sound haunted the quarters at night. The buzzing electric hum of that saw would start up before dawn and cut through the morning like the cry of some mechanical demon. Even when it wasn't running, you could feel it there, waiting. The children would wake from nightmares where that sound chased them through cotton fields that stretched to the edge of forever. Grace's mama, bless her suffering soul, had learned the bitter wisdom of slave quarters. How to cry without making sound, how to love without showing it, how to hope without speaking it aloud. She birthed Grace into a world where naming was dangerous, where a child's laugh could draw the wrong kind of attention, where survival meant becoming invisible as smoke. But Grace, Grace was different from her first breath. Not stronger in body, mind you, but different in spirit. She was one of them children born with old eyes that seemed to see straight through to the bone of things. While other young ones wailed at the harshness of this world, Grace watched. She learned. She listened to what wasn't said, 'cause in them slave quarters, child, the most important words were always the ones swallowed down. The old conjure woman who helped birth Grace, Mother Dinah they called her, took one look at that baby girl and whispered something low to Grace's mama. Something about how this child carried spirit weight in her tiny bones, how the ancestors had marked her special. But special, in them days, wasn't always a blessing. Sometimes it was a burden heavier than chains. As Grace grew from baby to girl child, she learned the rhythm of the plantation like other children learned their ABCs. She knew the sound of the overseer's boots on the porch of the big house, the crack of the driver's whip in the fields, the low moan that escaped from the quarter where they took the ones who'd tried to run. She learned that silence was sometimes the loudest sound of all, and that survival meant understanding when to be seen and when to disappear into the shadows. But most of all, Grace learned the sound of that electric saw. It became the heartbeat of her childhood, the rhythm that measured her days. And somewhere deep in her spirit, in a place where even the masters couldn't reach, Grace began to understand that she and that saw were tied together by something stronger than fear, something older than pain. The old folks always said that some souls are marked for testing, marked to carry the weight of their people's suffering, and turn it into something else, something that cuts both ways. Now listen here, folk, 'cause what I'm fixin' to tell you about Grace's growing years will make your heart heavy as lead. She came up in a world where the sound of machinery was the devil's own music, where the whir and buzz of electric saws sang lullabies of terror to the children in the quarters. That plantation, situated deep in the heart of cotton country, where the red clay drank more blood than rainwater, was a place that specialized in timber as much as cotton. Massive pine and oak trees fell under the bite of electric saws that could cut through ancient wood like it was soft butter. But Lord have mercy, them saws weren't just for trees. Everyone on that plantation knew it. The overseers made sure of that. Grace grew up knowing that mechanical scream like other children knew their mama's voice. Every morning, when the first bell rang across the quarters, you'd hear them saws start up in the timber yard. Sssst, a sound that went straight to your bones and rattled there like chains. The white folks called it progress, called it modern machinery making their work more efficient. The black folks knew better. We knew that sound was a promise and a threat all wrapped up in one electric whine. As a young'un, Grace would stand at the edge of the timber yard, watching them white men feed whole trees into them hungry metal mouths. Wood chips would fly like angry bees, and the smell of cut pine would hang thick in the air mixed with something else. Fear. 'Cause every slave on that plantation had heard the stories. Stories of what happened to folks who forgot their place, who spoke when they should have been silent, who looked massa in the eye when they should have kept their gaze on the ground. Sufferin' so bad, how them stories traveled through the quarters like fever. Whispered from mama to child, from field hand to house slave, carrying warnings disguised as ghost tales. They'd tell about Sam, who'd tried to protect his woman from the overseer's wandering hands, and how they'd held him down over that electric saw until his screaming finally stopped. They'd speak low about Mary, who'd been caught teaching letters to the children, and how the sound of that saw had followed her voice into silence. Grace listened to them stories with them old eyes of hers, taking in every word like a sponge soaks up blood. She learned that the saw wasn't just a tool. It was a character in their lives, with its own moods and hungers. Some days it would run smooth and quiet, cutting through lumber with almost gentle precision. Other days it would snarl and spit and scream like it was angry, like it was hungry for something more than wood. Brother Moses, the oldest field hand on the plantation, would always cross himself when that saw got to acting ornery. "That thing got a spirit in it," he'd mutter, "and it ain't a good spirit neither." He'd tell the young folks how machines could carry haints just like houses could, how the violence done with a tool would stick to it like blood sticks to hands. Sweet Jesus, how Grace would watch the white men handle that saw like it was some kind of sacred object. They'd oil its parts with the care other folks might tend a baby, check its blade with the attention a root doctor gives to healing herbs. The saw had its own shed, built special to house it, with walls thick enough to muffle its screams. But Lord knows you could still hear it. Even when it was silent, even when it was cold and still, you could feel its presence humming through the plantation like electricity running through wire. As Grace got older, maybe 9 or 10 years by plantation counting, she began to understand something that made her stomach turn cold as winter mornings. That saw wasn't just there to cut timber for building and selling. It was there to cut spirits, to slice hope away from the bone, to remind every black soul on that plantation that they lived and breathed at white folks' pleasure. The overseers would make sure the field hands could hear when they fired up that saw for purposes other than lumber. They'd time it special, right when folks were coming in from the cotton fields, tired and hungry, and looking forward to what little rest they could steal before tomorrow's labor began. That's when you'd hear it start up, and everyone would know what was happening in that timber shed. Mercy me, how Grace learned to read them sounds. The normal cutting of wood had one rhythm, steady, predictable, almost peaceful, if you could forget what it might be used for. But when it was cutting flesh instead of pine, the sound changed. got more urgent, more angry, punctuated by silences that were worse than the screaming. Grace could tell from the quarters whether someone was being taught a lesson or being taught their last lesson. The cruel overseer, Jackson by name, a man whose soul was already sold to Satan before he took his first breath on this earth. He took particular pride in the maintenance of that saw. He'd stroke its electric cord like other men might pet a faithful dog. He knew that machine held more power over the plantation than all the whips and chains combined. Fear is a terrible master, but it's an efficient one. Grace watched all this growing up, learning the terrible arithmetic of plantation life. She learned that resistance had a price measured in flesh and bone. She learned that dignity could cost more than most folks could afford to pay. But she also learned something else, something the overseers never intended to teach. She learned that even the instruments of terror could be understood, studied, maybe even mastered by someone willing to pay the price of knowledge. As she approached her 12th year, Grace had spent more time listening to that electric saw than most children spend learning to read. And in them dark quarters at night, when the saw was finally silent and the plantation slept the uneasy sleep of the guilty and the trapped, Grace would lie awake understanding something that would shape the rest of her days. That saw and her were connected by something deeper than fear, something older than pain. Gather round now, children, 'cause I need to paint you a picture of the place where Grace's childhood died and her understanding was born. This here plantation wasn't just fields and quarters and the big house sitting pretty on its hill like a white monument to sin. No, sir. This place had an auction block. Lord of glory, how that block sat in the center of the plantation yard like an altar to the devil himself, made from thick Georgia pine, weathered gray by rain and tears and time, standing 3 feet high so everyone could see clear what was happening when families got torn apart like paper in the wind. The wood of that block had soaked up so much sorrow that it had turned dark as dried blood, and on hot summer days, you swear you could see spirits rising from it like heat waves. Grace was maybe 8 years old when she first understood what that block was truly for. Up till then, she'd thought it was just a platform where massa stood to make announcements, where overseers would read plantation rules to folks who mostly couldn't read themselves. But then came the day when little Joshua's mama, Ruth, got sold to pay massa's gambling debts. Sweet Jesus, how that woman cried. Not the loud, wailing kind of crying that brings comfort through release, but the quiet, broken kind that cuts deeper than any whip. Ruth stood on that block in her one good dress, the yellow one she'd saved for Sundays and special occasions, holding Joshua's hand tight as she could without the chains cutting into her wrists. The auctioneer, a pale, thin man who talked like his mouth was full of cotton. He made Ruth and Joshua stand separate on that block while he called out their qualities like they were livestock at market. Strong back on this one. Good for field work or breeding. And this young buck here, maybe 6 years old, bright eyes, should train up nice for housework. Pitiful soul, how Joshua looked around with them wide eyes, not understanding why his mama was crying, why white folks were shouting numbers, why everything felt wrong as winter and summer. Grace watched from the edge of the crowd, her own mama's hand pressed tight over Grace's mouth to keep any sound from escaping. That was the day Grace learned the mathematics of human misery. She learned that love between mama and child meant nothing when weighed against the price of cotton. She learned that the auction block wasn't just wood and nails. It was a machine for breaking hearts, for separating souls that God had joined together. As the bidding went on, Grace saw something in Ruth's eyes that she'd never seen before. Not just sadness, but something deeper. A kind of dying that happened while the body kept breathing. When they finally sold Joshua to a plantation up in Tennessee and Ruth to a rice farm in South Carolina, Grace watched that woman's spirit leave her body while her heart kept beating. After that day, Grace paid different attention to the auction block. She learned its schedule. First Monday of every month, right after the cotton prices came in from Charleston. She learned its victims, always the ones who'd shown too much spirit, too much independence, or sometimes just the ones who'd outlived their usefulness in massa's eyes. Brother Jeremiah, who'd been sold after he'd learned himself to read and got caught teaching letters to the children. Sister Anna, whose conjure work had gotten too well known among the white folks' wives. Old Benjamin, whose joints had given out from 30 years in the cotton fields, but whose stories of Africa had made the young folks dream too much of somewhere else. Hurtin' something terrible. How Grace would watch the preparations for auction day. The overseers would oil the block like it was something sacred, make sure the rope was strong for tying hands, set up the shade cloth so the white buyers wouldn't get uncomfortable in the sun while they haggled over human flesh. The night before auctions, the quarters would go quiet as a graveyard. Folks would whisper prayers and goodbyes, knowing that morning light might bring separation forever. Mamas would hold their babies tighter, knowing that size and age were just numbers on a bill of sale. Men would look at their women with eyes full of love and terror, knowing that strong backs and fertile wombs were commodities that brought good prices. Grace learned to read the signs that pointed toward the auction block. When Massa's gambling debts got high, when the overseer started paying closer attention to who was strong and who was pretty, when the traders started coming around to evaluate the stock, she learned that the auction block was always hungry, always waiting for the next meal of human sorrow. But more than anything, Grace learned about the silence that lived in that place. Not the peaceful quiet of Sunday mornings or the exhausted hush of evening after long days in the fields. This was different. This was the silence of words that couldn't be spoken, of tears that had to be swallowed, of love that had to be hidden lest it make the parting hurt worse. Old folks say that some places hold on to the pain that's been suffered there, and Lord knows that auction block held more pain than ought to fit in one piece of wood. On moonless nights when the wind was right, you could swear you heard crying coming from that empty platform. Not the crying of the living, but the echo of all the sorrow that had been poured out there over the years. As Grace grew from child into young woman, she understood that the auction block was part of the same cruel system as the electric saw, the whipping post, and all the other instruments of control that kept black folks in chains. They were all part of the machinery of slavery, designed to break spirits and crush hope. But Grace also learned something else during them years of watching and listening. She learned that even in the face of the auction block, even when families were torn apart and sold like cattle, the human spirit found ways to survive. In the songs sung low in the quarters, in the prayers whispered in the fields, in the small acts of kindness that folks showed each other when the overseers weren't watching. And late at night, when the plantation slept and the auction block stood empty in the moonlight, Grace would look out from the quarters and understand that she was part of something bigger than the machinery of slavery. She was part of a people who had survived the Middle Passage, who had survived the auction block, who had survived the electric saw and the whipping post and all the other tools of oppression. The old conjure women always said that places of great suffering sometimes birthed great power, that the ground where blood and tears had been spilled could grow more than just cotton and tobacco. As Grace looked upon that auction block in the silver light of the moon, she began to understand that her own power was growing, fed by the pain she had witnessed, nurtured by the love that had been torn apart in that place. And somewhere deep in her spirit, Grace began to understand that the auction block had taught her its final lesson, that when all the words had been spoken, when all the tears had been shed, when all the goodbyes had been said, what remained was the choice between breaking and becoming something harder than the forces that sought to destroy you. Now listen here, children, 'cause I got to tell you about the man who thought fear was his personal plaything, who believed that terror needed an audience to be complete. Jackson Wade, that was the overseer's name, though speaking it still makes my mouth taste like ash and bitter herbs. He was one of them white men born with cruelty in his bones, raised on the notion that black suffering was entertainment for white eyes. Lord have mercy on his damned soul, but Jackson Wade was different from other overseers. Most of them cruel men did their work quick and brutal, like killing a chicken, fast, efficient, done with it. But Wade, he savored it. He was the type who needed witnesses to his power, who fed off the fear in other folks' eyes like some folks feed off honey. Wade stood tall as a cypress tree and twice as crooked, with pale eyes that looked like chips of dirty ice. His hair was the color of old straw, always slicked back with pomade that smelled like dead flowers. He dressed fine for an overseer, kept his boots polished to mirror shine, wore a pocket watch that caught the sun, carried a walking stick with a silver head shaped like a coiled snake. But all that finery couldn't hide the rottenness that lived in his heart. The man had come to the plantation maybe 2 years before Grace turned 13, brought in special by Massa himself, after the old overseer had died of a fever. Word was that Wade had a reputation throughout the cotton counties, not just for keeping slaves in line, but for making examples that other plantations would talk about for years. Massa wanted that kind of fear spread across his property like morning mist. Suffering so bad, how Wade took to his work. He studied the slaves like a snake studies mice, learning who was strong, who was weak, who might cause trouble, and who might need breaking. But more than anything, he studied who the other slaves looked up to, who they respected, who they loved. 'Cause Wade understood something that made him more dangerous than overseers who just used whip and chain. He knew that breaking one person in front of others could break a dozen spirits at once. Wade had special fondness for what he called teaching moments. Any time a slave showed the smallest sign of independence, any time someone forgot to bow their head low enough, or move fast enough, or show sufficient gratitude for their daily ration of suffering, Wade would call for a gathering. He'd ring that plantation bell and make everyone stop their work to come witness whatever lesson he had planned. Great God Almighty, how that man loved an audience. He'd stand up on the auction block, using that sacred place of sorrow as his personal stage, and speak to the assembled slaves like he was preaching some kind of gospel. His voice would carry across the plantation yard, smooth as honey but cold as January. "Now you all gather round," he'd say, adjusting his pocket watch and smiling like he was about to give out Christmas presents. "We got ourselves some educating to do today. Some of your people seem to be forgetting their place, forgetting who provides for them, who keeps them fed and sheltered. Well, memory is a funny thing. Sometimes it needs refreshing." The electric saw became Wade's favorite teaching tool. He discovered early that the sound alone could make grown men tremble, could make strong women weep before the lesson even began. Wade would oil that machine himself, check its blade, test its motor while everyone watched. The ritual of preparation was part of the torture, the waiting almost worse than what came after. Mercy me, how Wade would drag out them preparations. He'd talk while he worked, explaining to his captive audience exactly what they were about to witness and why it was necessary. "This machine here," he'd say, running his pale hand along the saw's metal housing, "this is modern efficiency, science and industry working together to maintain proper order. Your ancestors in Africa never saw such marvels, never had the benefit of such advanced education." Grace learned to read Wade's moods like other folks read weather signs. When he walked with that particular spring in his step, when he hummed under his breath, when he paid extra attention to the set of his hat, them were the days when someone was going to suffer for the entertainment of others. Wade needed that suffering to feel alive, needed the fear and pain of black folks to prove to himself that he mattered in this world. The man had particular hatred for what he called uppity behavior, any sign that a slave thought themselves too good for their condition. A woman who carried herself with too much dignity, a man who looked other folks in the eye when he spoke, a child who asked too many questions. All of these could catch Wade's attention in ways that meant trouble. But what Wade hated most of all was silence. Not the quiet obedience he demanded, but the kind of silence that felt like judgment. The kind of silence that said, "I see you for what you are, and you don't scare me." That kind of silence made Wade's pale skin flush red with rage, made his hands shake with the need to prove his power. Wade had been watching Grace for months before he finally decided she needed his special attention. He'd noticed how other slaves looked to her for strength, how even the oldest field hands would nod respectfully when she passed. He'd seen how she moved through the plantation with a kind of quiet dignity that made him itch with the need to break it. Some men need fear to have an audience, and Jackson Wade was chief among them. He fed off terror like some folks feed off corn and molasses, and he'd been going hungry for too long, watching Grace walk through his domain unbowed. The day would come soon when Wade's hunger for dominance would meet Grace's refusal to be diminished, and that collision would shake the very foundations of what everyone on the plantation thought they understood about power and submission. But Wade didn't know, couldn't know, that Grace had been preparing for this meeting her whole life, learning lessons from the electric saw, the auction block, and all the other instruments of oppression that white folks use to keep black spirits chained. Settle in close now, my children, 'cause I gotta tell you about the day when dignity got mistaken for defiance, when a young woman's refusal to break got interpreted as rebellion. It was a Tuesday morning in late September, when the cotton was ready for picking, and the air carried the first hint of autumn coolness that made everyone hope for relief from the killing heat of summer. Grace was working in the big house that day, one of the few times Massa had called her up from the quarters to help with the heavy cleaning before some important white folks came visiting. She'd been scrubbing the floors of the front parlor, working on her hands and knees to make them pine boards shine like honey, when Jackson Wade came stalking through with his boots still muddy from the fields. Lord have mercy, how that man tracked dirt across Grace's fresh-cleaned floor like he was marking territory. He walked back and forth, grinding that red Georgia clay into the wood Grace had just polished to perfection. And all the while, he was watching her from the corner of his pale eyes, waiting to see what she would do. Now any other slave girl might have spoken up, might have said, "Sir, I just finished cleaning that floor," or might have started cleaning again right away to show she understood her place. But Grace, she just kept working on the section she'd been scrubbing, moving her rag in slow, steady circles, not looking up, not speaking, not giving Wade the reaction he was hunting for. Sweet Jesus, how that silence started to work on Wade like a splinter under the skin. He stopped his pacing and stood there watching Grace work, waiting for some sign that she recognized his power to mess up her labor. But Grace just kept on with her scrubbing, methodical and calm, like she was alone in that parlor instead of being tested by a man who held life and death in his pale hands. "Girl," Wade finally said, his voice sharp as a blade, "you see this mess I made on your clean floor?" Grace looked up then, meeting his eyes for just a moment before lowering her gaze back to her work. "Yes, sir," she said, quiet as morning mist. "I see it." "Well?" Wade demanded, his face starting to flush that particular red that meant trouble was brewing. "What you going to do about it?" Grace dipped her rag back in the bucket, wrung it out careful and slow. "Going to clean it when I finish this section, sir," she said, still not looking at him, still not hurrying, still not showing the kind of frantic obedience that Wade fed on. Mercy me, how that answer hit Wade like a slap across his pale face. Not because Grace had been disrespectful. She'd said all the right words, used the proper tone, called him sir like she was supposed to. But there was something in her manner, something in the way she didn't scramble to fix his mess immediately, that told Wade she was cleaning that floor on her own terms, not his. Wade stood there for a long moment, his breathing getting heavier, his hands starting to clench into fists. He was looking for insolence, hunting for some excuse to make an example. But Grace's behavior walked the line perfect, obedient enough that he couldn't call it defiance, but independent enough that it felt like a challenge to his authority. "You got something to say about the way I walk through this house?" Wade asked, his voice getting lower and more dangerous. Grace kept working, her rag moving in them same steady circles. "No, sir," she said, "just doing the work I was given to do." That was when Wade understood that Grace's silence wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. It was the kind of quiet that said, "I see you trying to provoke me, and I'm not going to give you what you're looking for." It was dignity refusing to be baited into giving him an excuse for violence. Riled up beyond measure, Wade started pacing again, this time making even more mess, grinding his boots into the floor with deliberate force. But Grace didn't react. She just kept cleaning, patient as rainfall, steady as sunrise, giving him nothing to work with except perfect, maddening compliance. "Look at me when I'm walking," Wade snapped. Grace looked up, met his eyes for exactly as long as respect required, then went back to her work. "I said, look at me." Grace looked up again, held his gaze a moment longer, then returned to her scrubbing. Each time Wade demanded her attention, Grace gave it, but only what was required, only what respect demanded, never the cowering submission that would have fed his need to dominate. She was following every rule, meeting every demand, but somehow managing to keep her inner dignity intact while doing it. Full of rage that had no legitimate target, Wade finally stalked out of that parlor, leaving Grace to clean up the mess he'd made. But as he walked away, his mind was already working on how to break that quiet defiance, how to crack that maddening composure that made him feel small, despite all his power. Later that evening, after the white folks' visiting was done and Grace had been sent back to the quarters, Wade sat in his cabin drinking corn whiskey and nursing his wounded pride. He'd been made to look foolish by a slave girl, not through any action she'd taken, but through her refusal to act the way he wanted. Old folks always said that some white men couldn't stand the sight of black dignity, that it reminded them of something they'd lost in themselves when they chose to build their lives on the suffering of others. Wade was one of those men. Grace's quiet strength made him feel weak, and weakness was something Jackson Wade couldn't tolerate in himself. That night, as Wade lay in his bed planning Grace's destruction, he convinced himself that her behavior had been deliberate disrespect, that her dignity was actually insolence in disguise. He told himself that she needed to be taught a lesson, not just for her own good, but for the good of every slave on the plantation who might get ideas about conducting themselves with too much self-respect. They always confused dignity with rebellion. Them white folks did. They couldn't understand that a person could follow every rule, obey every command, and still keep their spirit intact. To men like Wade, the only acceptable black person was a broken one, and Grace's refusal to be broken felt like a personal attack on everything he believed about the natural order of the world. As dawn approached, and Wade finally fell into uneasy sleep, his dreams were filled with the sound of the electric saw and visions of Grace finally showing the proper amount of fear. He'd teach her that dignity was a luxury that slaves couldn't afford, that respect was something only white folks deserved. But Wade didn't know that Grace had been expecting this day for years, had been preparing her spirit for whatever test was coming. He didn't understand that her dignity wasn't defiance, it was armor forged in the fires of every injustice she'd witnessed since childhood. Come close now, children, and brace your hearts for what I'm about to tell you, 'cause this is when Grace first met that electric saw, not as observer, but as victim, when the instrument of terror tried to claim her flesh and blood and found something it wasn't prepared for. It was a Wednesday morning, 3 days after that business in the big house parlor, when Jackson Wade decided it was time to teach his lesson. He'd spent them days building up to it, letting word spread through the quarters that someone was going to learn, respect the hard way, making sure everyone on the plantation knew to expect a demonstration of power. Lord have mercy. How Wade orchestrated that morning like he was directing some kind of unholy theater. He rang the plantation bell just after dawn, before the field hands had even finished their breakfast gruel, calling everyone to gather in the yard where the electric saw waited like a hungry beast. Grace knew it was for her soon as she heard that bell. She'd felt it in her bones the night before, felt it in the way Wade had been watching her during evening rations, felt it in the thick silence that had fallen over the quarters like a heavy blanket. The other slaves knew too. You could see it in their faces, in the way they avoided looking at Grace directly, as if her approaching suffering might be contagious. As Grace walked toward the yard where Wade waited by his machine, she felt the weight of every eye on the plantation. The field hands stood in a semicircle, forced to witness whatever was about to unfold. The house slaves clustered near the big house porch, where Massa and his family had come out to watch the entertainment. Even the children were there, 'cause Wade believed that lessons should start young, suffering so bad how Grace's mama tried to reach for her girl as she passed by. But the other women held her back, knowing that any interference would just make things worse for both mother and daughter. Grace looked at her mama one time, just one quick glance, and in that look passed all the love and forgiveness and understanding that words couldn't carry. Wade stood beside the electric saw like a preacher beside his pulpit, all dressed up in his finest clothes for the occasion. He'd oiled his hair extra slick, polished his boots to mirror shine, even put on a clean white shirt that made his pale skin look like raw chicken. The saw gleamed beside him, its blade catching the morning sun like a silver tooth in a demon's mouth. "Now then," Wade announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the yard like a judgment from on high. "We got ourselves a teaching moment here today. This girl, He pointed at Grace. "This girl has forgotten her place, has forgotten who provides for her, who keeps her fed and clothed and sheltered from the harsh world outside these plantation boundaries." Grace stood where they'd positioned her, just a few feet from that hungry machine, her hands bound behind her back with rope that cut into her wrists. She didn't look at Wade while he spoke, didn't look at the saw, didn't look at the crowd of terrified faces watching her. She looked up at the sky, at the morning clouds drifting across the blue like ships on a peaceful ocean. "This machine here," Wade continued, running his pale hand along the saw's metal housing, "represents progress, science, the advancement of Christian civilization. And sometimes progress requires demonstration. Sometimes education requires practical application." Sweet Jesus, how that saw screamed when Wade pulled the cord and brought it to life. The electric motor caught with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, and that circular blade started spinning faster than the eye could follow, creating a silver blur that seemed to cut through the air itself. The crowd of slaves pushed back instinctively, fear rippling through them like wind through wheat. Some of the children started crying. Some of the women began praying under their breath. But Grace stood her ground, still looking at the sky, still finding something in them clouds that gave her strength. Wade grabbed Grace by the shoulder and forced her down onto her knees beside the spinning blade. The sound was so loud that it seemed to fill the entire world, drowning out thought, drowning out prayer, drowning out everything except the immediate terror of being so close to that mechanical death. "Last chance," Wade shouted over the saws, screaming. "Last chance to show proper respect, to beg forgiveness for your uppity ways." Grace looked at him then, for the first time since this whole business had started. Looked right into his pale eyes with them deep, knowing eyes of hers. And what she said next would echo through that plantation for years to come. "I got nothing to beg for," she said, her voice somehow carrying clear over the saw's roar. "I ain't done nothing wrong." That was when Wade's face went white with rage, whiter than his fancy shirt, whiter than cotton in the fields. He'd given her a chance to grovel, to break, to become the kind of terrified, submissive creature that would satisfy his need for dominance. But Grace had chosen dignity over safety, truth over survival. Wade grabbed her arm and forced her hand toward that spinning blade. The metal bit into her palm, then her wrist, then her forearm, cutting through flesh and muscle like it was nothing more than pine wood. Blood sprayed across the yard in bright red arcs, spattering Wade's white shirt, painting the ground crimson. But here's the thing that made everyone's heart stop beating for a moment. Grace didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't break. She gritted her teeth and endured, making not a sound while that saw chewed through her arm like some mechanical devil. When everything should have ended, when any normal person would have bled to death or died from shock, Grace was still breathing, still conscious, still looking at Wade with them unbroken eyes that said she knew exactly what kind of man he was and wasn't impressed. Wade stumbled backward, covered in Grace's blood, staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. The saw kept running, kept screaming, but somehow it sounded different now. Frustrated maybe, like it had been cheated of its expected meal. The crowd stood in absolute silence, not understanding what they'd just witnessed. They'd seen people punished before, seen the saw used to teach lessons, but they'd never seen anyone survive it with their spirit intact. Never seen anyone look at Jackson Wade afterward like he was the one who should be afraid. And in that moment of impossible quiet, with Grace's blood pooling around her knees and the electric saw still howling its mechanical hunger, everyone on that plantation understood that something had changed. The rules they'd all lived by, the laws of power and submission that governed their world, had just been rewritten by a young woman who refused to be broken. Listen close now, children, because what happened next shook that plantation to its very foundations. After Grace stood up from that electric saw with her arm torn to ribbons but her spirit whole, after she looked Jackson Wade in his pale eyes like she was the one with power and he was the one who should be afraid, the very air on that plantation changed. Sweet Jesus, how the silence stretched across that yard like thick molasses. Every soul standing there, Field hands, house slaves, drivers, even the white folks watching from their porch. They all stood frozen like they'd witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be possible in this world. The electric saw kept screaming its mechanical song, but nobody moved to turn it off. They just stared at Grace, bleeding but unbowed, as she slowly got to her feet. Lord have mercy on them poor souls who witnessed it. Their minds couldn't make sense of what their eyes had seen. They'd watched that saw bite deep into Grace's flesh, watched her blood spray across the yard like rain, watched what should have been her death. But there she stood, steady as an old oak tree, looking at Wade like he was the one bleeding. Brother Moses, that old field hand who'd seen more suffering than any man should carry in one lifetime, he was the first to understand. His ancient eyes went wide as saucers, and he started backing away from the crowd, shaking his head and muttering words in a language that came from across the ocean. Ash, he whispered, over and over. Ash, ash, ash. Power, spirit power, the kind that didn't bow to white man's law. The younger slaves, the ones who'd been born on American soil and raised on Christian preaching, they didn't have words for what they'd seen. But they felt it in their bones, felt something shifting in the foundation of their world. Fear and wonder mixed together in their hearts like bitter herbs in sweet honey. Mercy me, how the children clung to their mama's skirts. They'd been brought to witness a lesson in submission, to see what happened to slaves who forgot their place. Instead, they'd seen something that made them question everything they'd been taught about who had power and who didn't. Their wide eyes stayed fixed on Grace like she was some kind of walking miracle, some kind of sign from the spirits their grandmamas whispered about in the dark quarters. The house slaves, they were the ones most shaken by what they'd witnessed. They'd learned to survive by reading white folks' moods, by understanding the rules that governed their lives. But Grace had just torn up every rule they knew, had shown them that sometimes the impossible could walk among them, wearing a torn cotton dress and bleeding hands. Suffering so bad, how Jackson Wade tried to regain control. He stood there covered in Grace's blood, his white shirt painted crimson, his pale face flushed with rage and something that might have been fear. He was shouting orders, demanding that someone fetch the doctor, cursing and spitting like a man possessed by demons. But his voice sounded different now, smaller, less certain. The absolute authority that had ruled that plantation like iron law had developed a crack, and everyone could hear it. When Wade commanded the field hands to get back to work, some of them moved slower than before. When he ordered the house slaves to return to their duties, they glanced back over their shoulders at Grace instead of keeping their eyes properly downcast. Great God Almighty, how that crack in authority spread like water through dry ground. The slaves didn't speak of it directly. They weren't foolish enough for that. But they carried it in their eyes, in the way they held their heads a little higher, in the whispered conversations that stopped when white folks came near. That evening in the quarters, when the work was done, and the overseers had retreated to their cabins, the slave community gathered around Grace like she was some kind of holy vessel. They brought rags to bind her wounds, brought healing herbs that the root doctors had taught them to use, brought water, and what little food they could spare from their own meager rations. Old Mother Dinah, the conjure woman who'd helped birth Grace all them years ago. She examined Grace's mangled arm with hands that had seen everything this world could show. She traced the saw cuts with fingers that knew the difference between natural healing and something else entirely. Child, Mother Dinah whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of wisdom and suffering. What you got inside you ain't of this world. Ain't completely of this world anyway. You carrying something from the ancestors, something from across the water, something from the time before time. Grace didn't answer, couldn't answer really, 'cause she didn't understand it herself. All she knew was that when that saw bit into her flesh, she'd felt something rise up inside her, something old and powerful and patient, like voices calling from somewhere far away, telling her to hold on, telling her she was more than just flesh and bone and blood. The other slaves looked at Grace with a mixture of awe and terror. They'd prayed for deliverance, prayed for someone strong enough to stand against their oppressors. But now that she was here among them, bleeding but unbroken, They weren't sure what to do with her. Miracles, they learned that night, were beautiful and terrible things that changed everything they touched. As word of what had happened spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, some folks began to whisper about signs and portents, about how Grace's survival meant that change was coming, that the old order was beginning to crumble. Others worried that her defiance would bring down white wrath on all their heads, that they'd all suffer for one woman's refusal to break. But whether they saw Grace as salvation or danger, every soul on that plantation understood that nothing would ever be the same. The electric saw still sat in its shed, still waited with its hungry blade, but it no longer held the same terror. Jackson Wade still walked the plantation with his whip and his authority, but his power had been revealed as something less than absolute. In the deepest part of the night, when even the insects had gone quiet and the plantation slept the uneasy sleep of the guilty and the oppressed, Grace lay in her cabin listening to the whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. Voices in languages she'd never learned but somehow understood, telling her that her test had only just begun. The spirits of her ancestors, those who'd died in slave ships and auction blocks and whipping posts, they were gathering around her like a protective circle. They'd been waiting for someone strong enough to carry their memory forward, someone willing to pay the price of resistance. Grace closed her eyes and let them ancient voices wash over her like a river of memory and pain and love. She understood now that her survival wasn't just about her. It was about every slave who'd ever suffered in silence, every mother who'd lost her children to the auction block, every man who died under the whip rather than bow to injustice. Settle in close, my children, 'cause I got to tell you about the days that followed, when Jackson Wade's pride demanded satisfaction and Grace's spirit prepared for deeper testing. The first survival had been a shock to everyone, including Grace herself. But what came next would test whether her strange power was real or just the cruel accident of a missed artery. Lord have mercy how Wade raged in his cabin that first night. He drank corn whiskey until his vision blurred and his hands shook, trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. He'd used that electric saw to break dozens of slaves over the years, had watched it reduce strong men to whimpering children and proud women to broken shadows. But Grace had looked at him afterward like she was disappointed in his performance. The second time Wade called for the bell, it was a week later. He'd spent them 7 days convincing himself that Grace's survival had been luck, that the saw had malfunctioned, that her wounds hadn't been as deep as they'd appeared. White folks, you understand, they got powerful skill at explaining away anything that challenges their understanding of how the world works. Sweet Jesus, how the quarters buzzed with fearful whispers when that bell rang again. Everyone knew it was for Grace, knew that Wade's wounded pride wouldn't rest until he'd proven his power over the woman who'd made him look small. The slaves gathered in the yard with heavier hearts this time, understanding that they were about to witness either a miracle or a tragedy. Grace walked to the saw that second morning with the same quiet dignity she'd shown before. Her arm still bore the scars from the first cutting, pink and white lines that traced across her dark skin like map roads to places no one wanted to visit. But she held that injured arm steady, showed no favor to it, moved like a woman who'd made peace with pain. "You ready to show proper respect now?" Wade demanded, his voice trying to reclaim the authority that had slipped from his grasp. "You ready to beg forgiveness for your uppity ways?" Grace looked at him with them deep, knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to his cowardly soul. "I told you before," she said, her voice clear as mountain water. "I got nothing to beg for." That second cutting was worse than the first. Wade, driven by desperation and wounded pride, pressed the spinning blade deeper, held it longer, made sure everyone could see the blood and bone and sinew being chewed apart by them hungry metal teeth. The saw screamed its mechanical song of destruction, drowning out the gasps and prayers of the watching crowd. But in the middle of that terrible symphony, something else began to rise, something that started as a whisper in Grace's throat and grew into a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, older than her years. She began to sing, not a plantation spiritual or a white man's hymn, but something else entirely. The words weren't in English or even the broken French that some of the older slaves remembered from Louisiana. They were in a tongue that came from across the ocean, from the time before ships and chains and auction blocks. The melody was ancient, carrying rhythms that matched the beating of human hearts, the washing of ocean waves, the turning of seasons that had marked time since the world was young. Mercy me, how them slave voices began to join her song. One by one, without understanding the words but recognizing something deeper than language, they added their voices to Grace's. The children sang high and sweet, the women sang low and mournful, the men sang deep as thunder rolling across cotton fields. Brother Moses, that old field hand who remembered Africa in his bones, he began to weep as he sang. The melody Grace had started awakened something in him that he'd thought was lost forever. The sound of his grandmother's voice calling ancestors, the rhythm of drums that had once marked births and deaths and celebrations in a land where black skin wasn't a mark of bondage. Even as the saw bit into her flesh for the second time, even as her blood painted the red Georgia clay even redder, Grace kept singing. Her voice never wavered, never broke, never showed the pain that had to be coursing through her like liquid fire. She sang like a woman calling across vast distances, like someone summoning help from places that couldn't be reached by ship or horse or foot. And something answered her call. The old folks who witnessed it swore they saw shadows moving at the edge of their vision, figures that looked like people but walked without touching the ground. They felt a presence gathering in that yard, something that made the hair on their arms stand up, and their hearts beat in rhythm with Grace's ancient song. When Wade finally shut off the saw and stepped back, expecting to see Grace collapsed in a pool of her own blood, she was still standing, still singing, still looking at him with eyes that held no fear, no submission, no acknowledgement of his power over her. The second survival shook the plantation worse than the first. If the first time could be explained as luck or divine intervention or medical mystery, the second time suggested something else entirely, something that challenged not just Wade's authority, but the entire foundation of white supremacy that held their world together. Great God Almighty, how the white folks on that plantation began to whisper among themselves. They gathered on their porches in the evening, drinking their whiskey and smoking their pipes, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Some talked about calling in a doctor from Atlanta. Others suggested bringing a preacher to perform an exorcism. A few even muttered about the wisdom of selling Grace to some distant plantation before she caused more trouble. But Wade wouldn't hear of it. His pride was wounded deep as a mortal injury, and he couldn't rest until he'd broken the woman who'd made him look weak in front of his own slaves. He began to plan for a third demonstration, this one more terrible than the first two combined. In the slave quarters, the mood was different after the second cutting. The initial shock had given way to something else, a growing awareness that Grace's survival meant more than just one woman's resistance. It meant that the power structures they'd lived under all their lives weren't as solid as they'd seemed. It meant that change was possible, even if it came at a terrible price. Grace herself was changing too. Each encounter with the saw seemed to awaken something deeper within her, something that connected her to the long chain of ancestors who'd suffered and died and somehow found ways to resist. She felt their presence growing stronger around her, felt their voices joining with hers in that ancient song of survival and defiance. The third time would test whether Grace's strange power was growing stronger or whether Wade's determination to break her would finally succeed. But one thing was certain. The plantation would never be the same regardless of what happened next. Come close now, children, and hear about the time when fear changed sides on that plantation, when the instrument of terror began to seem less fearsome than the woman who wouldn't bow to it. After Grace survived the electric saw twice, refusing to break or beg or show the proper submission to white authority, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power that had governed that place for generations. Lord have mercy on them white folks, 'cause they didn't know how to handle what they'd witnessed. Massa himself began avoiding the yard where the saw stood, taking different paths around his property, rather than walk past the place where his overseer's authority had been challenged so publicly. His wife stopped coming out to watch the demonstrations, claiming the sight upset her delicate constitution. Even their children seemed subdued, whispering among themselves about the slave woman who wouldn't die. Jackson Wade, his pale face growing thinner and more desperate with each passing day, became like a man possessed by demons. He walked the plantation obsessively, checking and rechecking his authority, demanding greater shows of submission from every slave he encountered. But his voice had lost its edge of certainty, and everyone could hear the difference. Suffering so bad, how Wade began to plan more elaborate punishments. If 2 encounters with the saw hadn't broken Grace, he'd find ways to make the third more terrible, more public, more final. He ordered special preparations, sharpened the blade until it gleamed like a mirror, oiled the motor until it ran smoother than silk, even built a platform so everyone on the plantation could see clear what was happening. But while Wade planned his escalated torture, something else was growing in the slave quarters. Something that started as whispered conversations and grew into a quiet revolution of the spirit. The slaves began to look at each other differently, began to carry themselves with a dignity that hadn't been there before Grace's survival. Great God Almighty, how the field hands started singing different songs. Not the slow, mournful spirituals that white folks expected, but rhythmic work songs that seemed to carry secret messages. The women in the house began moving with more purpose, less cowering. Even the children played games that involved pretending to be strong instead of pretending to be obedient. Mother Dinah, that old conjure woman, she began teaching things that hadn't been spoken aloud for years. In the darkest part of night, when the overseers were asleep and the patrols were far away, she'd gather the young folks and tell them about root work and protection spells, about ancestors who'd never truly died, about powers that came from across the water and couldn't be whipped out of a person's spirit. "That girl Grace," Mother Dinah would whisper, her ancient eyes reflecting the light of hidden candles. She connected to something bigger than this plantation, bigger than slavery itself. She carrying the memory of our people, the strength of those who came before. And that strength, children, it can't be cut with no saw, can't be broken with no whip. The third time Wade rang that plantation bell, calling everyone to witness his latest attempt to break Grace's spirit, the atmosphere was different from the first 2 occasions. The slaves still gathered as ordered, still stood in their required positions around the electric saw. But there was something new in their posture, something that suggested they were no longer just victims watching another victim suffer. Sweet Jesus, how Grace approached that saw for the 3rd time. She walked like a queen going to her coronation instead of a slave going to her punishment. Her head was high, her back straight, her steps measured and deliberate. The scars from the previous cuttings marked her arms like badges of honor, proof that she'd faced the worst Wade could do, and emerged unbowed. "Last chance," Wade shouted over the saw's mechanical screaming, but his voice cracked on the words. "Last chance to grovel, to beg, to show proper respect." Grace looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Wade," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard, "you the one who ought to be begging forgiveness from all the folks you hurt, all the families you broke apart, all the spirits you tried to destroy. But you too proud and too lost to understand that." Mercy me, how Wade's face went white as cotton at harvest time. He grabbed Grace's arm and forced it toward the spinning blade with all the fury of a man fighting for his very identity. The saw bit deep, chewing through flesh and muscle with mechanical efficiency, painting the red Georgia clay with Grace's blood. But this time, something extraordinary happened. As Grace began to sing that ancient song, as her voice rose above the saw's screaming, other voices joined her from beyond the circle of watching slaves. Voices that seemed to come from the very air, from the ground beneath their feet, from the Spanish moss hanging in the trees. The spirits of the ancestors, called by Grace's song and sustained by her refusal to break, began to manifest around that electric saw like heat shimmer on a summer day. Brother Moses fell to his knees, recognizing faces in that spirit crowd, faces of folks who died under whips and chains, but whose essence had never truly departed. As the saw continued its work, as Grace's blood flowed like a red river across the plantation yard, she kept singing, and with each note the gathering of spirits grew stronger, more visible, more present. They surrounded the electric saw like a protective circle, their ancient power meeting the mechanical violence of the modern world. When Wade finally stepped back, expecting to see Grace dead or dying, she was still standing, still singing, still surrounded by the gathered presence of all those who'd suffered and died in this place, but whose spirits refused to rest until justice was done. The silence that fell across that plantation was deeper than any quiet the slaves had ever known. It was the silence of a world that had suddenly realized its fundamental assumptions might be wrong, its power structures less permanent than they'd seemed. Wade stared at Grace with eyes that had gone beyond rage into something approaching madness. The other white folks backed away from the yard, their faces pale with fear of something they couldn't understand but could no longer deny. Even the electric saw seemed to whisper more quietly, as if it too had been humbled by what it had witnessed. In that moment of absolute quiet, Grace spoke the words that would echo through that plantation for generations to come. "Your power ends where my spirit begins, Mr. Wade. And my spirit, it got no ending. Gather your spirits close now, my children, 'cause what I'm fixing to tell you about happened when Jackson Wade's pride had grown so wounded and poisonous that it threatened to consume not just Grace, but the very foundations of that cursed plantation. After 6 more encounters with that electric saw, each one more brutal than the last, each one ending with Grace standing bloodied but unbowed, Wade had descended into a madness that made him dangerous to everyone around him. Lord have mercy on his damned soul, but Wade had become like a man possessed by demons of his own making. He walked that plantation with wild eyes and shaking hands, talking to himself about respect and proper order and the natural way of things. His once pristine appearance had deteriorated into something that frightened even the white folks. Hair uncombed, clothes stained with Grace's blood from previous demonstrations, boots scuffed and muddy from his obsessive pacing around the plantation grounds. Sweet Jesus, how that man had tried everything his twisted mind could devise. After the 3rd cutting failed to break Grace, he'd sharpened that saw blade until it could split hairs. After the 4th survival, he'd bought a bigger motor to make the blade spin faster. After the 5th, he'd constructed special restraints to hold Grace more securely against the cutting edge. After the 6th, he'd even brought in a preacher from town to witness what he called the casting out of demons. But none of it worked. None of it could explain how a slave woman could endure what would kill any normal person, how she could stand up from that saw time after time with her dignity intact and her spirit unbroken. Each failure only drove Wade deeper into his desperate fury, deeper into his need to prove that his power was absolute and unchallengeable. The 7th cutting had been witnessed by neighboring planters who'd come to see the spectacle for themselves. The 8th had drawn curious white folks from as far away as Savannah, all wanting to see the slave woman who wouldn't die. But instead of validating Wade's authority, these public demonstrations only served to spread word of his inability to break one defiant black woman. Suffering so bad, how the white community began to whisper about Wade's competence. Some said he'd lost control of his plantation, that he'd allowed one slave to make him look weak in front of the entire region. Others suggested that Grace might be protected by dark forces that required different handling, maybe a burning instead of cutting, maybe selling her to some far-off place where her influence couldn't spread. But Wade wouldn't hear of selling Grace or trying different methods. His pride had become so tangled up with that electric saw, so dependent on breaking her with the very tool that had given him power over so many others, that he couldn't conceive of any other solution. In his twisted mind, admitting defeat to Grace would mean admitting that everything he'd built his identity on was false. The slave quarters, meanwhile, had become a different place entirely. The repeated demonstrations of Grace's supernatural endurance had transformed the entire community's understanding of what was possible. Folks who'd spent their whole lives accepting that white power was absolute and unchangeable began to whisper about different possibilities, different futures. Great God Almighty, how them whispers spread through the quarters like wildfire. Stories about Grace's survival mixed with half-remembered tales of African magic, with Bible stories about Daniel in the lion's den, with legends of conjure women who could turn masters' weapons against themselves. The children began playing games where they pretended to be Grace, standing strong against invisible saws. The women sang her ancient song while they worked in the big house, filling them white walls with rhythms that made the masses nervous without knowing why. Brother Moses, that old field hand who carried Africa in his memory, had become something like a prophet in the quarters. He'd gather folks around him in the deep of night and tell them about how grace was fulfilling prophecies that had been spoken across the ocean generations ago, prophecies about a woman who would come in the time of greatest darkness, who would show the people that their chains were not as strong as their spirits. She carrying all of us, Mother Moses would whisper, his ancient eyes reflecting candlelight like stars in a dark sky. Every ancestor who died in bondage, every child sold away from their mama, every man who died under the lash, all them spirits living in her, giving her strength, showing us that death ain't the worst thing that can happen to a soul. Mother Dinah, the conjure woman, had been working root and conjure like never before, preparing for what she sensed was coming. She'd gathered herbs from the deepest parts of the swamp, had drawn protective symbols in the dirt around Grace's cabin, had spoken with spirits that came to her in dreams, warning of a great testing that would determine not just Grace's fate, but the fate of everyone on that plantation. By the time Wade announced the 9th demonstration, his mind had snapped completely from the strain of repeated failure. He declared it would be the final test, the ultimate proof of white authority. He ordered the construction of a special platform that would elevate the electric saw above the crowd, making sure every soul on the plantation and every curious visitor could see clear what happened. This time, Wade announced to the assembled crowd on that gray October morning, his voice carrying the harsh edge of madness, this time, there will be no mercy, no reprieve, no chance for divine intervention. This rebellious spirit will be broken once and for all, or I'll know the reason why. The crowd that gathered for the 9th cutting was the largest yet. Word had spread through the county about the slave woman who couldn't be killed, and white folks had come from 3 neighboring plantations to witness what they assumed would finally be her destruction. Some had even brought their wives and children, treating the event like a county fair or a church social. Mercy me, how Grace approached that elevated platform with the same dignified bearing she'd shown from the very beginning. 8 previous encounters with that mechanical demon had left her body marked with scars that told the story of her endurance, but her spirit remained as unbroken as the day she'd first defied Wade's authority in the big house parlor. As Grace climbed the steps to the platform, the gathered slaves began to hum, not loudly enough to draw punishment, but soft and low like the sound of wind through pine trees. It was the melody Grace had taught them, the ancient song that seemed to call across vast distances to summon help from places beyond the reach of earthly power. Wade had prepared special restraints for this final demonstration, iron shackles that would hold Grace's arms steady against the saw blade, prevent any possibility of pulling away at the last moment. He'd also brought a doctor from town to examine the body afterward, to prove once and for all that Grace was as mortal as any other slave. "Behold," Wade shouted to the assembled crowd as he started the electric motor, "the price of rebellion. Behold what happens to those who forget their place in God's natural order." The saw screamed to life with a sound that seemed to shake the very earth, its blade spinning faster than ever before, hungry for the blood that had been denied it 8 times already. Wade grabbed Grace's shackled arm and forced it toward the whirring metal with all the strength in his pale, trembling body. But as that blade bit into Grace's flesh for the 9th time, something extraordinary began to happen. The humming in the slave quarters grew louder, joined by voices that seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. The Spanish moss hanging from the trees began to sway, without any wind to move it. The air itself seemed to thicken with presence, with the gathering of forces that had been building through 8 previous demonstrations. And Grace began to sing, not the quiet, contained melody of previous cuttings, but something that rose from the deepest places of her spirit, something that seemed to call down the power of every ancestor who'd ever suffered in bondage, every spirit who'd died fighting for freedom, every soul who'd refused to let their humanity be destroyed by white man's cruelty. The song that emerged from Grace's throat was in a language older than English, older than the slave ships that had brought her people across the ocean. It was a language of roots and rivers, of earth and sky, of powers that existed before white folks ever dreamed of chains and whips and auction blocks. As that ancient song filled the air around the electric saw, the gathered crowd began to see things that challenged their understanding of the possible. Shadows moved at the edges of vision, taking shapes that looked almost human but walked without touching ground. The very air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement, revealing presences that had been invisible but never absent. This time, they said, there would be no return. But Grace had never truly left. She'd simply been growing stronger, gathering the power of all those who'd come before, preparing for the moment when the accumulated suffering of her people would transform into something that could not be contained by any earthly authority. Come close now, my children, and steel your hearts for what I'm about to tell you, 'cause this is the moment when the impossible happened right there in front of everyone's eyes, when all the laws that governed that plantation world suddenly showed themselves to be as fragile as spiderwebs in a hurricane wind. When that electric saw finished its 9th cutting of Grace's flesh, when the blood had painted the platform red as a sunset, when Jackson Wade stepped back expecting to finally see the broken body of the woman who'd haunted his dreams for months, Grace was still standing. But this time was different from all the others. This time, the very air around her seemed to be alive with presence, thick with the gathered spirits of all those who'd suffered and died in that place. Sweet Jesus, how the silence that fell over that plantation was deeper than any quiet ever experienced by living souls. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that comes when the world itself holds its breath, when the fundamental order of things shifts so dramatically that even the insects and birds stop their natural music to witness what shouldn't be possible. The white folks who'd come to watch Grace finally die stood frozen like statues carved from pale stone. Their mouths hung open, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes when everything you've been taught about how the world works suddenly reveals itself to be a lie. The doctor from town, who'd brought his medical bag to examine the corpse, dropped his instruments in the red dirt and backed away from the platform like he'd seen Satan himself rise from the depths of hell. Lord have mercy on them poor souls, 'cause their minds couldn't process what their eyes were showing them. They'd witnessed 8 previous demonstrations, each one more brutal than the last, each one ending with Grace standing bloodied but alive. But this 9th cutting had been different, deeper, longer, more thorough. By every law of medicine and nature, no human being could survive what they'd just watched that electric saw do to Grace's body. But there she stood, blood flowing from wounds that should have killed her 10 times over, her dark eyes clear and unafraid as she looked down at the crowd of witnesses, and around her, visible now to everyone present, was a congregation of spirits that seemed to stretch back through generations of suffering and resistance. Mercy me, how them ghost spirits filled the air around that platform. Brother Moses, his ancient eyes streaming with tears of recognition, began calling out names of folks who'd died on that plantation years before. Sam, who'd been cut down by the saw for protecting his woman. Mary, who'd been killed for teaching children to read. Old Benjamin, who'd been worked to death in the cotton fields. All of them were there, standing around Grace like a protective circle, their translucent forms shimmering in the October sunlight. But it wasn't just the recent dead who'd answered Grace's call. The spirit stretched back further, much further, to the slave ships that had brought their people across the Atlantic, to the African villages where their ancestors had lived free, to the very beginning of the chain of suffering that had led to this moment. The air itself seemed to pulse with their presence, thick with the accumulated pain and resistance of centuries. Grace stepped forward on that platform, her movement causing a ripple of terror to run through the watching crowd. Blood still dripped from her wounds, still pooled at her feet. But she moved like a woman walking through her own garden rather than someone who'd just survived mortal injury. When she spoke, her voice carried across that plantation yard with the authority of someone who'd been to the edge of death 9 times and returned with knowledge that couldn't be challenged. "Mr. Wade," Grace said, her words cutting through the supernatural silence like a blade through silk. "You've been trying to break something that can't be broken. You've been trying to kill something that already died long ago and came back stronger. You've been trying to prove your power over folks whose power comes from places you don't understand and can't reach." Jackson Wade stood paralyzed, his pale face drained of all color, his hands shaking so violently that the saw's control cord trembled like a live snake in his grip. The tool that had given him authority over hundreds of slaves, that had been the foundation of his reign of terror, suddenly seemed as powerless as a child's toy in the presence of forces he'd never imagined existed. Great God Almighty, how the gathered spirits began to move around that platform. They walked among the crowd of witnesses, their forms becoming more solid, more visible, more present with each passing moment. The white folks shrank back from their touch, but the slaves reached out to them, recognizing faces of loved ones lost, feeling the presence of ancestors they'd thought were gone forever. The electric saw, still running but somehow quieter now, its mechanical scream reduced to a whisper, seemed to struggle against the spiritual energy that surrounded it. The motor stuttered, the blade wobbled, as if the machine itself was being overwhelmed by forces it hadn't been designed to encounter. Mother Dinah, that ancient conjure woman, fell to her knees in the dirt and began speaking in tongues that came from across the ocean, languages that had been suppressed but never forgotten, words that carried the power of traditions older than slavery itself. Her voice joined with Grace's in creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the earth. "This is the hour," Mother Dinah chanted, her words somehow audible despite the continuing whisper of the electric saw. "This is the time that was prophesied in dreams and visions, when the instruments of oppression would turn against the oppressor, when the machinery of suffering would serve the cause of justice. The moment stretched like molten honey, thick and golden and impossible to measure by ordinary time. Everyone present, white and black, free and enslaved, witness and participant, understood that they were experiencing something that would echo through generations, something that would be told and retold until the end of time." Grace raised her wounded arms toward the October sky, blood still flowing but her strength undiminished, and spoke words that seemed to come from the collective voice of every ancestor gathered around her. "Your time is ending, Mr. Wade. Your kind of power, built on fear and pain and the breaking of spirits, that time is passing away. What's coming next, you won't recognize and you can't control." The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself. Even the electric saw finally stopped its mechanical whisper, the motor dying without anyone touching the controls. In that absolute quiet, the only sound was the gentle breathing of spirits and the soft whisper of Spanish moss moving in a breeze that touched only the supernatural. When the impossible happens, the world holds its breath. And in that held breath, in that moment of absolute stillness, everyone present understood that the old order had died, and something new was being born from the blood and courage of a woman who'd refused to be broken by any earthly power. The foundations of slavery itself had cracked, and through those cracks the light of a different kind of freedom was beginning to shine. Listen close now, children, and prepare your spirits for what happened next. 'Cause this is when the story turned like a river changing course, when the instrument of terror learned to sing a different song altogether. After Grace stood before that ninth cutting with the spirits of centuries gathered around her, after the very air had become thick with ancestral power, something shifted that changed everything that came after. Lord have mercy, but Grace began to move toward that silent electric saw, like she was approaching an old friend instead of the machine that had tried 9 times to destroy her. The crowd watched in absolute terror as she reached out her blood-slicked hand and touched that metal housing that had housed so much suffering, so much fear, so much desperate cruelty. The moment her fingertips made contact with that cold steel, something extraordinary happened. The saw, which had fallen silent when its motor mysteriously died, began to hum again, but not with the harsh mechanical scream of destruction it had always carried before. This was different. This was a sound that seemed to harmonize with Grace's ancient song, a resonance that spoke of transformation rather than torture. Sweet Jesus, how that machine began to change under Grace's touch. The metal that had gleamed with malevolent hunger now seemed to pulse with a different kind of energy, an energy that came from the spirits surrounding it rather than from the electrical power that white man's science had fed into it. The blade that had been designed to cut and maim and terrorize now seemed to vibrate with purpose that had nothing to do with causing pain. Jackson Wade, standing frozen with horror as he watched his most feared tool responding to Grace's touch instead of his own, began to back away from the platform. His pale face had gone beyond white into something gray and sickly, like a man watching his own death approach on quiet feet. The walking stick with the silver snake head fell from his trembling hands, clattering against the wooden platform with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the supernatural quiet. "No," Wade whispered, his voice breaking like a child's. "No, that's not possible. That machine belongs to me. I control it. I decide who lives and who dies. I decide." But the electric saw had already made its own decision. As Grace lifted it from its mounting, and great God Almighty, how that heavy machine seemed to weigh nothing in her blood-slicked hands. The gathered spirits began to sing in harmony with her ancient melody. Their voices created a chorus that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the trees, from the sky, from every corner of that plantation where suffering had been planted like seeds in blood-soaked ground. Mercy me, how the white folks began to scatter like leaves before a hurricane. The doctor who'd come to examine Grace's corpse stumbled off that platform so fast he left his medical bag behind. The neighboring planters who'd come to witness Wade's final triumph over the rebellious slave woman pushed and shoved each other in their desperate attempt to reach their carriages and ride away from whatever supernatural justice was about to unfold. But the slaves, oh, how the slaves understood what they were witnessing. They didn't run. They didn't cower. They formed a circle around that platform like congregants around a pulpit, their voices joining the ancestral chorus that filled the air with power, older than plantation bells, older than auction blocks, older than the ships that had brought their people across the salt water of suffering. Brother Moses, that ancient field hand who carried Africa in his bones, began to speak in the tongue his grandmother had taught him before the slavers came, calling down blessings on Grace and curses on all those who'd used machines to break human spirits. Mother Dinah raised her gnarled hands toward the October sky and spoke prophecies that made the Spanish moss sway without wind, that made the red Georgia clay pulse like a living heart beneath their feet. Grace stood in the center of that supernatural storm, holding the electric saw that had been transformed by her touch and by the presence of all those who died under its blade. No longer the instrument of white terror, it had become something else entirely, a tool of justice, a voice for the voiceless, a weapon in the hands of those who'd been weaponless for too long. "Mr. Wade," Grace called out, her voice carrying across that plantation yard with the authority of every ancestor who'd ever cried out for justice. "You understand now? You see how power really works? It don't come from fear. It don't come from machines. It don't come from making folks suffer for your entertainment. Real power comes from the spirits of those who refuse to be broken, who refuse to let their humanity be destroyed by your cruelty." Wade was backing away faster now, stumbling over his own feet in his terror, but there was nowhere for him to run that would be far enough. The entire plantation had become a sacred space, consecrated by Grace's blood and by the presence of all those spirits who'd been waiting for this moment of reckoning. Suffering so bad, how Wade tried to assert his authority one last time. He pulled out his whip, that leather snake that had been his constant companion in the work of breaking spirits, and raised it toward Grace like some kind of shield against the supernatural forces surrounding her. "You're still my property," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You're still just a slave. I own you. I own all of you. This is my plantation, and you'll obey my rules." But Grace was already moving, the transformed electric saw humming its new song of justice in her steady hands. The blade that had tasted her blood 9 times was ready to taste something different, something that would balance the scales of suffering that had been weighed against her people for so long. "Mr. Wade," Grace said, and her voice was gentle now, almost sad, like a mother explaining hard truths to a child who refused to understand. "No system lasts forever. No power built on cruelty can stand against the gathered strength of those it tries to destroy. You spent so long teaching lessons with that saw, now it's time for you to learn one." The saw in Grace's hands began to sing louder, its new harmony joined by the voices of centuries of resistance, by the power of every prayer spoken in slave quarters, by the strength of every mother who'd lost children to auction blocks, by the courage of every man who'd chosen death over submission. It was no longer Jackson Wade's instrument of terror. It had become the voice of justice itself, speaking in a language that cut through lies and pretense to reach the truth beneath. No system prepares for the day when fear learns to walk in the opposite direction, when the instruments of oppression turn against those who wielded them, when the very tools of cruelty become weapons in the hands of the oppressed. And on that October morning, as Grace stepped down from the platform with the transformed electric saw humming its song of justice, everyone present understood that they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of power, one that couldn't be whipped into submission, couldn't be sold at auction, couldn't be contained by any earthly authority. The saw's new song grew louder as Grace approached Wade, who'd fallen to his knees in the red dirt, his pale hands raised in a gesture that might have been prayer or might have been surrender. The circle of spirits around them grew more solid, more present, until every soul on that plantation could see clear the faces of those who'd died under Wade's cruelty, but had never truly departed. "Please," Wade whimpered, his voice reduced to something less than whisper. "Please, I was just doing what I was taught. I was just maintaining order. You was just choosing," Grace interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of 9 encounters with that blade, 9 trips to the edge of death and back. Every time you picked up that saw, every time you decided to make someone suffer for your entertainment, you was choosing. And now it's time for you to understand what them choices cost. The transformed electric saw hummed its harmony of justice as Grace raised it above her head, and in that moment, everyone present could feel the weight of history pressing down on that plantation yard like a heavy hand. This wasn't just about Grace and Wade. This was about every slave who'd ever been broken by white cruelty, every family torn apart by auction blocks, every spirit crushed under the weight of system that treated human beings like property. When the blade finally fell, it sang a song of ending, not just the ending of Jackson Wade's reign of terror, but the ending of an entire way of understanding power and submission, cruelty and resistance, the possible and the impossible. The saw cut clean and true, guided by hands that had learned to hold suffering and transform it into strength, operated by a spirit that had been broken 9 times and had chosen to mend itself into something unbreakable. Gather close now, my children, and steady your spirits for what I'm about to tell you, 'cause this is when justice wore Grace's face and spoke with the voice of every ancestor who'd ever cried out from underneath the whip. This is when the electric saw that had tasted so much innocent blood finally learned the flavor of guilt, when the instrument of white terror became the hand of divine retribution, in the grip of a woman who'd been tested beyond all human endurance and found unbreakable. Sweet Jesus, how the silence stretched across that plantation yard as Grace stood over Jackson Wade's trembling form, that transformed electric saw humming its new song of justice in her steady hands. The blade that had cut her flesh 9 times now vibrated with a different kind of hunger, a righteous appetite that had been building through centuries of unpunished cruelty, through generations of black suffering that had cried out to heaven for recompense. Lord, have mercy on that wretched man's soul. But Wade could feel the weight of every sin he'd ever committed pressing down on him like grave dirt. He could see in Grace's eyes the reflection of every slave he'd broken, every family he'd torn apart, every mother he'd made to watch her children sold away like livestock. The spirits gathered around that platform weren't just Grace's ancestors, they were his victims, returned from whatever realm holds the souls of those who died crying for justice. "Please," Wade whimpered, his voice reduced to something smaller than whisper, smaller than breath. "Please, I got family, I got children. I was just doing my job. I was just following orders. The system made me do it." But Grace looked down at him with eyes that had seen through the veil between life and death, eyes that had gazed into the heart of suffering itself, and found there not bitterness, but understanding. Terrible, complete understanding of how cruelty breeds more cruelty, how fear creates monsters, how systems of oppression poison the souls of oppressor and oppressed alike. Mr. Wade, Grace said, and her voice carried the weight of prophecy, the authority of someone who'd walked to the edge of existence 9 times and returned with knowledge that couldn't be challenged. The system didn't make you enjoy it. The system didn't make you smile when children cried for their mamas. The system didn't make you sleep peaceful at night after you'd used this saw to teach your lessons in terror. That was all you, choosing cruelty when you could have chosen mercy, choosing violence when you could have chosen understanding. Great God Almighty, how the air around them shimmered with spiritual presence. The ancestors who'd answered Grace's call weren't just observers to this moment of reckoning. They were participants, their combined will flowing through Grace's arms, guiding her hands, speaking through her voice. Every slave who'd ever died under Wade's authority was there. Every broken spirit demanding acknowledgement. Every silenced voice crying out for the justice that had been denied them in life. Brother Moses, that ancient field hand who remembered Africa in his bones, began to speak in the tongue his grandmother had taught him, calling down not curses but something deeper. The natural consequences that flow when the universe finally balances scales that have been weighted too long toward injustice. His voice joined with Mother Dinah's conjure chanting, with Grace's ancestral singing, creating a harmony that seemed to make the very ground beneath their feet pulse with righteous power. The electric saw in Grace's hands had become something beyond mechanical device, beyond mere tool of violence. It had been transformed by her blood, sanctified by her suffering, consecrated by the presence of all those spirits who'd been waiting through long decades for this moment of divine accounting. The blade hummed with purpose that transcended the crude intentions of its original creators, vibrating with frequencies that resonated in the deepest chambers of the human heart. Mercy me, how Wade tried one last time to assert his authority, to reclaim some vestige of the power that had defined his existence. He struggled to his feet, his pale face flushed with desperate rage, his hands reaching for the whip that had been his constant companion in the work of breaking black spirits. "I own you," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I own all of you. You're nothing but property, nothing but animals that got too proud, too uppity, too forgetful of your place. I'll have you all whipped, I'll have you all sold, But Grace was already moving, the transformed saw singing its song of justice as she stepped forward. The blade caught the October sunlight and seemed to throw it back transformed, creating patterns of light that spoke of endings and beginnings, of old orders dying and new ones being born from the blood of those who'd paid the ultimate price for freedom. "Mr. Wade," Grace said, and now her voice carried not just her own authority but the collective voice of every slave who'd ever been sold away from family, every woman who'd been forced to breed like livestock, every man who died under the lash rather than submit to degradation. "It's time for you to understand what your lessons felt like from the receiving end. Time for you to learn what it means to be powerless, to be at the mercy of forces beyond your control, to face your own mortality while someone else holds the power of life and death." The saw in Grace's hands began to sing louder, its harmony joined now by sounds that seemed to come from the very foundations of the plantation. The whispered prayers of those who died in the slave quarters, the muffled sobs of mothers who'd lost children to auction blocks, the defiant songs of work gangs who'd found ways to maintain dignity even under the weight of impossible oppression. Suffering so bad, how Wade finally understood that all his power had been illusion, all his authority nothing more than the temporary permission of a system built on lies and sustained by violence. He could see in Grace's eyes the truth he'd spent his life trying to avoid, that every human being, regardless of the color of their skin, carried within them the same spark of divine creation, the same capacity for love and pain and hope and despair. The circle of spirits around them grew more solid, more present, until even the white folks who hadn't yet fled the plantation could see clear the faces of those who died under Wade's cruelty. They stood witness to this moment of reckoning, their translucent forms shimmering with otherworldly light, their voices joining the chorus that seemed to rise from the red Georgia clay itself. "This is for Sam," Grace said as she raised the singing saw above her head, "who died protecting the woman he loved from your wandering hands." The blade descended with surgical precision, guided by hands that had learned to transform suffering into strength, operated by a spirit that had been broken 9 times and had chosen each time to mend itself into something more resilient than before. "This is for Mary," Grace continued, the saw singing its song of justice as it found its mark, "who died teaching children to read when you decided that knowledge was too dangerous for black minds to hold." The second cut was deeper, more purposeful, delivered with the accumulated weight of every injustice that had been perpetrated in that place of suffering. Wade's screams joined the saw's mechanical song, creating a harmony of pain that seemed to satisfy something in the spiritual realm that had been hungry for acknowledgement, for recognition, for the simple understanding that black lives had value and meaning and worth. "This is for every child sold away from their mama," Grace said, her voice growing stronger with each word, more resonant with the power of those who'd been silenced too long. "Every family torn apart for your profit, every spirit broken for your entertainment, every life destroyed for your convenience." The transformed electric saw cut through flesh and bone and sinew with the same mechanical efficiency it had always possessed, but now its work served a different master, answered to a higher authority than white supremacy and plantation law. Each cut was measured, deliberate, guided by a sense of justice that had been refined in the fires of unimaginable suffering. As Wade's blood painted the platform red, the same red as Grace's blood had painted it 9 times before, the assembled slaves didn't cheer or celebrate. This wasn't a moment for joy. It was a moment for recognition, for acknowledgement, for the simple understanding that accounts had been balanced and debts had been paid in the only currency that Wade had ever understood. The spiritual transformation wasn't just about Grace's survival, or even about Wade's destruction. It was about the fundamental reordering of power on that plantation, the recognition that no system of oppression could stand forever against the accumulated will of those it sought to destroy. The electric saw had become a symbol of that transformation, a tool that had been sanctified by Grace's blood and transformed into an instrument of divine justice. When the cutting was finally finished, when Wade's screams had faded into the supernatural silence that surrounded the platform, Grace stood covered in blood that wasn't her own for the first time in months. The saw in her hands had returned to mechanical quiet, its work of balancing accounts finally complete, its hunger for justice finally satisfied. "Listen close now, my children, and feel the weight of what came after. 'Cause when justice has been served and accounts have been balanced, the world doesn't celebrate. It holds its breath and tries to understand what it has witnessed." The silence that fell across that plantation after Grace finished her work with the electric saw was deeper than any quiet that had ever settled over that blood-soaked ground, deeper than the hush that follows thunder, deeper than the stillness that comes when the heart stops beating, but the soul hasn't yet departed. Sweet Jesus, how that silence stretched across the cotton fields and through the Spanish moss hanging from ancient trees like shrouds. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something too large and terrible and necessary to be contained by human understanding. Every person on that plantation, black and white, slave and free, understood that they had witnessed something that would echo through generations, something that would be whispered about in quarters and big houses alike until the end of time. Grace stood on that platform, covered in Wade's blood instead of her own for the first time since this whole business had begun, holding an electric saw that had finally learned the difference between justice and revenge, between righteous retribution and mindless violence. The transformed machine hummed quietly in her hands, its work complete, its hunger satisfied, its mechanical soul purged of the cruelty that had defined its existence. Lord, have mercy on them that watched, 'cause they didn't know whether to run in terror or fall to their knees in worship. The white folks who'd come to see Grace finally destroyed stood frozen like pillars of salt, their pale faces drained of all color, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes when everything you've believed about the natural order of the world suddenly reveals itself to be built on sand. The slaves who'd been forced to witness Wade's demonstrations month after month, who'd watched their sister cut down 9 times and seen her rise again each time stronger than before, they understood what they were seeing, even if they couldn't put words to it. This wasn't just the death of one cruel overseer. This was the death of a way of thinking, the end of a system that had convinced itself that some human beings were more human than others. Massa himself had watched the final cutting from the safety of his big house porch, his wife and children clustered behind him, like chicks behind a hen. When Grace looked up from Wade's body and met his eyes across that blood-soaked yard, he knew without words that his authority over her had ended. Not just his legal ownership. That might continue until the Emancipation Proclamation made its way to their corner of Georgia, but his power to break her spirit, to reduce her to something less than human, to treat her as property instead of person. Great God Almighty, how the spirits of the ancestors began to fade as the October sun climbed higher in the sky. They'd answered Grace's call, had gathered to witness justice finally served, had lent their strength to her arms and their voices to her song. But their work was finished now, their long vigil ended, their hunger for acknowledgement finally satisfied. One by one they shimmered and dissolved back into whatever realm holds the souls of those who die, crying for justice, leaving behind only the memory of their presence and the knowledge that they had not been forgotten. Brother Moses, that ancient field hand who carried Africa in his memory, fell to his knees in the red dirt and began to weep. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of release, tears that carried the weight of decades spent watching his people suffer without recourse, without hope, without any expectation that the scales of justice might ever be balanced. His tears mixed with the blood that had soaked into the Georgia clay, consecrating that ground in ways that no church service or plantation chapel could ever achieve. Mother Dinah, the conjure woman whose root work had helped sustain Grace through 9 encounters with that mechanical demon, raised her gnarled hands toward the sky and spoke words in a language that came from across the ocean, thanking ancestors and spirits and the divine forces that move through the world to ensure that suffering doesn't go unanswered forever. Her voice carried across the plantation like a benediction, like a prayer of gratitude for justice, delayed but not denied. Mercy me, how the very air seemed different after Wade's death. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on that plantation like a heavy hand was lifting, replaced by something that felt like possibility, like the first breath taken after nearly drowning, like the sun breaking through storm clouds that had blocked its light for too long. The slave quarters would never again echo with the sound of that electric saw being prepared for another demonstration. The auction block would never again witness families being torn apart for the entertainment of white spectators. The whipping post would never again taste the blood of those whose only crime was refusing to forget their humanity. But Grace knew, could feel it in her bones the way old folks feel changes in weather, that this victory came with a price that hadn't yet been fully calculated. Killing Wade had been necessary, justified by every law of natural justice, but it had also marked her as something that the white world could never allow to exist. She was no longer just a rebellious slave who needed breaking. She had become something far more dangerous, a symbol of black power, a living reminder that white supremacy was not the divine law they'd convinced themselves it was. The electric saw in her hands had grown quiet, its mechanical song replaced by a silence that seemed to hum with potential energy. Grace understood that the machine had served its purpose, had been transformed from instrument of terror into tool of justice, had completed its work of balancing accounts that had been weighted too long toward cruelty. She set it down gently on the platform, treating it with the respect due to something that had served the cause of righteousness, and stepped away from Wade's body. Sufferin' so bad, how the white folks began their retreat. The neighboring planters who'd come to witness Grace's final destruction climbed into their carriages with hands that shook like autumn leaves, their faces pale as cotton, with the understanding that what they'd seen on Wade's plantation could happen on their own. The doctor who'd brought his medical bag to examine Grace's corpse packed up his instruments and left without a word, his scientific understanding of what was possible forever altered by what he'd witnessed. The slaves watched these departures with eyes that had learned to see beyond the surface of things, understanding that their white oppressor's retreat wasn't strategic, it was existential. The myth of white invincibility had been shattered by a black woman's refusal to die, and no amount of legislation or social convention could repair that fundamental crack in their worldview. As the day wore on and news of Wade's death spread beyond the plantation boundaries, Grace found herself at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond her personal victory over one cruel overseer. Word traveled through the slave quarters of neighboring plantations like wildfire, carrying with it the understanding that resistance was possible, that white power was not absolute, that the spirits of the ancestors still moved through the world to protect and empower those who refused to be broken. But with that understanding came danger. Grace knew that her survival and Wade's death would be seen by the white authorities as a threat that had to be contained, an example that had to be made, a symbol of black power that had to be destroyed before it could inspire others to similar acts of resistance. The very victory that had freed her from Wade's immediate cruelty had also marked her as a target for every white person in Georgia who understood that their way of life depended on black submission. In the quarters that night, as the slaves gathered around Grace to hear her speak about what she'd experienced during those 9 encounters with the electric saw, she felt the weight of prophecy settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She understood that her story was just beginning, that the power awakened in her by ancestral spirits came with responsibilities that extended far beyond her personal survival. "Listen to me now," Grace told the assembled slaves, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd walked to the edge of death and returned with knowledge that couldn't be challenged. "What happened today wasn't about me getting revenge on one cruel man. It was about showing all of us that the power they use to keep us down, that power has limits, that power can be turned around, that power can be taken away from them and used to protect ourselves." The electric saw sat silent on its platform, covered now with Wade's blood instead of Grace's, transformed from symbol of white terror into monument to black resistance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of whether the power awakened in Grace could survive in a world determined to destroy anything that threatened the established order. But tonight, for the first time in months, the slave quarters slept without fear of the electric saw, without terror of Wade's demonstrations, without the crushing weight of absolute white authority pressing down on their dreams. Grace had given them something more precious than freedom. She had given them the knowledge that freedom was possible. "Come close now, my children, and let these old bones tell you why Grace's name still carries weight in the wind, why her story still calls to us across all the years that have passed since that October morning when justice wore her face and spoke with her voice. 'Cause what happened on that Georgia plantation wasn't just one woman's victory over one cruel man. It was a crack in the foundation of a system that had convinced itself it was ordained by God and sustained by nature. Listen here, and understand that Grace didn't become no saint after Wade's death, didn't turn into some untouchable figure floating above human pain and struggle. No, sir. What made her story powerful, what made it echo through the quarters and hide in the songs and live in the prayers of folks who needed something to hold on to in the darkest hours, what made her real was that she stayed human through it all. Sweet Jesus, how that woman carried the weight of what she'd done. Killing Wade wasn't no moment of pure triumph, wasn't no joyful release from suffering. It was a necessary act that came with a price measured in sleepless nights and haunted dreams, in the understanding that she'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Grace knew that Wade's blood on her hands marked her as something the white world could never forgive, could never forget, could never allow to exist in peace. The weeks that followed Wade's death brought changes to that plantation that ran deeper than new overseer appointments or modified work schedules. The very air felt different, charged with possibilities that hadn't existed before Grace's 9 encounters with the electric saw. Slaves who'd spent their whole lives moving with heads down and eyes averted began to carry themselves with something that might have been dignity, not open defiance. They weren't foolish enough for that, but a quiet understanding that white power wasn't the absolute force they'd been taught to accept. Lord have mercy, how that understanding spread beyond plantation boundaries. Word of Grace's survival and Wade's death traveled through the underground networks that connected slave communities across the South, like nerve pathways carrying messages through a vast body. Field hands whispered her story during cotton picking. House slaves hummed melodies that carried coded references to electric saws and ancestral spirits. Children played games that involved standing strong against invisible demons. But Grace herself understood that her victory was temporary, that forces were already gathering to undo what she'd accomplished, to restore the old order through whatever violence might be necessary. She could feel it in the way white folks looked at her when they thought she wasn't watching, could hear it in the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, could sense it in the increased patrols that rode the county roads with dogs and guns and hemp rope. Great God Almighty, how Grace spent them final weeks preparing for what she knew was coming. She gathered the young folks around her in the deep of night and taught them things that Mother Dinah had whispered, things about root work and conjure, things about the spirits that move through the world to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She showed them how to read signs in the Spanish moss and the flight patterns of birds, how to find protection in crossroads ceremonies, and how to call on ancestors when the living world offered no help. "Remember this," Grace would tell them, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd looked death in the eye 9 times and lived to tell about it. "They can chain your body, they can sell your flesh, they can even take your life, but they can't touch what's real in you, what's eternal in you, what connects you to all the folks who came before and all the folks who'll come after. That part of you belongs to the spirits, belongs to the ancestors, belongs to forces older than slavery and stronger than white man's law." Mercy me, how Grace knew her time was running short. She could feel it in her bones the way old folks feel storm weather coming, could see it in the dreams that visited her sleep, could hear it in the whispered warnings that came from spirits who'd grown fond of her during their long acquaintance. The white authorities were planning something that would erase her story, would turn her from symbol of resistance into cautionary tale about the consequences of forgetting one's place. Brother Moses, that ancient field hand, who'd become like a father to Grace during her trials, understood what was coming too. He spent his evenings teaching her songs in languages that came from across the ocean, melodies that would survive even if the voice that sang them didn't, rhythms that would carry her story forward, through generations of folks who needed something to sustain them through their own trials. "Child," Moses would say, his voice heavy with the wisdom of 7 decades spent watching his people suffer and endure, and somehow find ways to survive. "What you done here, what you become, that ain't ending with your body. That's just beginning. You planted seeds in ground that been watered with too much blood for too long. Them seeds gonna grow into something the white folks can't cut down, can't burn out, can't whip into submission." Mother Dinah, that conjure woman who'd helped Grace understand her own power, worked root and conjure like never before during them final weeks, creating protections that would last long after Grace herself had passed from the physical world into whatever realm holds the spirits of those who died fighting for justice. She bound Grace's story into herbs and roots, sealed her memory into bottles that would be buried in crossroads, wove her essence into songs that would survive in the voices of children not yet born. When they finally came for Grace, and they came with dogs and guns and rope and all the violence that white supremacy could muster when confronted with evidence of its own mortality, she met them with the same dignity she'd shown during those 9 encounters with the electric saw. She didn't run, didn't hide, didn't beg for mercy from folks who'd never learned the meaning of the word, suffering so bad how Grace's final moments echoed her first confrontation with Wade's authority. She stood straight and proud as they fitted the noose around her neck, looked her executioners in the eye with the same unbroken gaze that had driven Wade to madness, sang the same ancestral song that had sustained her through cutting after cutting with that transformed electric saw. But here's the thing that made Grace's story immortal, that transformed her from individual victim into eternal symbol. Her death didn't end her resistance. If anything, it multiplied her power, scattered her essence across the entire South like seeds carried on hurricane winds. Every slave who heard her story understood that white power wasn't absolute, that resistance was possible, that the spirits of the ancestors still moved through the world to protect and empower those who refused to be broken. The electric saw that had tried 9 times to destroy Grace became a relic of transformation, a monument to the understanding that no instrument of oppression could stand forever against the accumulated will of those it sought to break. Some say it was buried with Wade's body. Others claim it was hidden in the deep swamp where conjure women could call on its power when justice needed serving. But the truth is simpler and more powerful than any single location could contain. That saw lived on in every act of resistance, every refusal to submit, every moment when the oppressed looked their oppressors in the eye and said, "No more." Grace's story survived because it spoke to something deeper than individual courage, something more fundamental than personal resistance. It spoke to the understanding that systems built on cruelty contain the seeds of their own destruction, that power rooted in violence cannot stand against power rooted in spirit, that the accumulated suffering of generations will eventually find voice and demand accounting. And so we tell her story still, pass it down through voices that carry the memory of her refusal to be broken, that remember the sound of that electric saw being transformed from instrument of terror into tool of justice. We tell it because Grace understood something that every generation has to learn anew, that freedom isn't given, it's taken, that dignity isn't granted, it's claimed, that justice doesn't arrive on its own schedule, it comes when good people decide they've waited long enough. Her name echoes through the quarters still, whispered in prayers and woven into songs, carried in the hearts of folks who understand that resistance takes many forms, but always requires the same fundamental choice: to remain human in the face of systems designed to reduce you to something less than human. The old folks say that on October nights when the Spanish moss hangs heavy and the air grows thick with memory, you can still hear Grace singing that ancestral song, still see the spirits gathering around places where justice was served and accounts were balanced. They say the electric saw still hums its transformed melody, calling to those who need reminding that no power built on cruelty can stand forever against the accumulated strength of those who refuse to be broken. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory. And memory, Lord, how memory endures. It lives in the voices that tell these stories, in the hearts that refuse to forget, in the spirits that gather when justice calls for witnesses. Grace's story isn't history. It's prophecy, promise, and prayer all wrapped into one. It's the understanding that every generation gets tested, and every generation gets the chance to choose between submission and resistance, between safety and truth, between survival and dignity. We keep her memory here, in the quarters where suffering was transformed into strength, in the songs where pain became power, in the stories where one woman's refusal to be broken became everybody's reminder that breaking isn't the only choice. We keep it alive because Grace understood something that echoes still, that the price of freedom isn't paid once and forgotten, but over and over, by every soul brave enough to stand up and say, "I am still here. I am still human. I am still unbroken." And that's why Grace's name still carries weight in the wind, still calls across the years to remind us that resistance is possible, that dignity can survive the worst that power can do, that the spirits of those who came before still move through this world to protect and strengthen those who follow in their footsteps, the ones who suffered, suffered, the ones who resisted, left memory burning bright as torches in the darkness. And that memory we guard with our lives, we pass down with our voices, we keep sacred in our hearts, here, in the legends of the lost slave quarters.